Shelbyville, like south of Decatur.
Down there.
So I just
Is
have
it icy coming back?
No. How about you?
2:30.
Oh God.
No, I don't even want to talk about it. I thought maybe once you'd be out as late as me. Shelbyville, God, I haven't done it in a long
Yeah.
time.
And then I get okay. So you know, I'm driving to this thing in like cornfields. I'm like, I guess people will come. But it was a little winery. It's called Willow Ridge Winery. It must be a pretty neat place to do this. I can do it all the day.
morning. This poem is called Youth Sunday by Rita Dove, and I can tell you it was commissioned as part of the 1619 project. A number of the readings are today from that project. This morning's already good. Summer's cooling, Addie chattering like a magpie. But today we are leading the congregation. Ain't that a fine thing? All in white like angels. They'll be sighing when we appear at the pulpit and proclaim, "Open your hymnals. Addie, what's the page number again?" Never mind, it'll be posted, I think, I hope. Hold still, Carol, or else this sash will never sit right. There, now you do mine. Almost 11, I'm ready. My, don't we look, what's that word that Reverend used in last Sunday's sermon? Oh, I got it. Ethereal.
This is why Unitarian Universalists light a chalice. During the darkest days of World War II, in the middle of a fascist occupation of Eastern Europe, Unitarians worked to help people escape persecution by hiding them on their way to neutral countries. They used a symbol to show who they were and that they were here to help. This symbol was a lit chalice, a symbol for helping those in need. The chalice is now lit.
Good morning. This morning, our weekly worship practices are winnowed to their essence and seasoned with Quaker simplicity. Our guest in the pulpit this morning, Professor Matthew Countryman, who I will transition to calling Matthew more from here on, is a lifetime Quaker with deep Quaker roots. As a result of worship simplicity, we will aim for 50 minutes or so that we may readily regather with Matthew starting at 11:30 for questions and answers and conversation. Along with doses of silence and spoken word, all of the piano music that Jamie Passman has played and will play in the closing song works of this program are of civil rights origin or reference. Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Hinsdale, this place of liberal religious pursuit in the heart of Hinsdale, Illinois, for 153 years and counting. I am Charlie Fisher, a member of this church. I am the worship associate for this morning's gathering. We particularly thank the insights and examples of all of the worship committee led by Dave Lloyd, all of the social justice work of this church including of Marion Honell Wilson, so versed in her career outside of this church and her crucial role in our finding ways to become a welcoming congregation and more. That was over 20 years ago. And Marion, I had particularly consulted about the closing works they were singing. So thank you for that, Marion. And it's also thanks for your ever-expanding racial and social justice work and more within this church over the course of decades, and by the very significant strides you now continue in your retirement from your professional career, your strides as a present-day president of Community Diversity Group of LaGrange. We thank Gene Schaefer for microphones and more, Hospitality Team 6 for providing refreshments and so very much more. And we thank Alex and Ben for just now having reinforced to us the origins of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee chalice and of the ongoing core of the whys and wherefores of the chalice symbol. We thank Tony Metters, who will read a reading. We thank Megan Griffin, who will read a reading. Music coordinator and pianist Jamie Passman, perfect example, ever ardently attuned to the musical moment. Thank you. And all seasoned by your decades of work in jazz and particularly blues venues, a many. We are privileged to have our pulpit populated today by University of Michigan's Professor Matthew Countryman. Visitors among us, I say welcome. We are happy you are here. We hope that you will find your experience here today to be fulfilling in every way. We publish our news and notes weekly, typically distributing via email every Friday. There may be hard copies of the current news and notes in the living room just south of this room. Also, if you write your email address into the guest register, we can be certain that you will receive future issues. Please take pause for a quick moment to think if there is anything church program-wise urgent that you wish to step forward to emphasize today. I will get back to you in a moment. Meanwhile, I have just these two. One, be certain to read those news and notes and the church's website to learn so very much current activities and more of this church. The other is that this church has called or otherwise engaged many a minister over its more than 15 decades. Continuing that tradition, just 2 weeks from today, we will welcome contract minister Reverend Beth Johnson to begin her ministry to and with this church. As has been highlighted in recent weeks, you can start to get acquainted with Reverend Johnson through links on our church website. And very importantly, to give Reverend Beth a head start in making our acquaintance, Karen and the greeting group are creating a folio to give to Reverend Beth, a folio of photos, concise remarks, and such from each of us in our own words. Karen McDowell and Claire Sheldon remind you to see them downstairs for the photo op to get your photo included in the folio. Just a few more things here. Does anyone have anything they would like to step forward to emphasize in addition to those two things? All right. Our offertory, I'm going to just preface these things so we don't have to pause to say them at their moments. Our offertory will occur after the sermon. Planning ahead so that that moment is less businessy, I say now, as to not say then, that cash collected will go directly to the church's financial purposes. The same will be true of checks where there is no entry in the memo line. If there is a particular purpose, such as for your pledge, please be certain to enter that purpose on your check's memo line or attach a note to your cash. Our sharing of joys and concerns will occur in a few moments. Joys and concerns is our time to further share of community, a range of matters from celebrations to concerns and the in-between. We are reminded to know that this worship gathering is being streamed and archived on YouTube. Your decision to most appropriately state people's first name or last name too, or neither, is your individual choice, cognizant of YouTube. Toward today's joys and concerns, which intend to be in a manner of Quaker meeting, please feel very free to share of simply what moves you. Like true Quaker meeting, today's joys and concerns will be silent, only broken by spoken voices. While in true Quaker meeting, silences can be extended and of random length, ours will be condensed with only short intervals of silence between spoken words. Count perhaps 6 seconds after your predecessor before you start. Use the wireless microphone here at the tree, on the table at the tree, and then hand it along to your successor. There's no need to switch the microphone off or on. That's all taken care of by the tech team. So in final close of announcements, just to frame the day, questions and answers with Matthew are scheduled to begin around 11:30 or shortly after, right here at the tree. It will be live in person, but no YouTube for that part. Restrooms are at the bottom of the stairs and elevator, and coffee and refreshments are in their usual location downstairs, as well as today in the living room immediately adjacent. Now, a musical moment, after which I will make a few more remarks to start joys and concerns. A most positively unforgettable Quaker meeting memory for me at the summer camp where I met Matthew and so many life journey peers is of a camper colleague named Mark. Mark was born deaf. He could deftly read the lips of all people he interfaced with, and he taught hands sign language to dozens of fellow campers and camp staff. Though Mark could not ever have heard his own words, he had trained his audible voice to shape words and sentences understandable to people, all that Mark talked to. Mark stood tall outdoors in an extended moment of silence during one of the morning's daily Quaker meetings, and with perfect enunciation spoke just 5 words. The trees are so beautiful. The word trees was beautifully extended, and the word beautiful clearly syllabic. That moment is forever beautiful. And so now, in very condensed, silent Quaker meeting of sorts, in the quietly simple extraordinary architectural inner beauty of this historic auditorium, this place that amplifies the extraordinary inner beauty of each and all of us. It's this time to step to the microphone here at the tree to briefly share of community and or of that you are otherwise moved to share. Quaker meeting quite condensed in context of providing for the ardent and urgent reflections and challenges that will soon be spoken here this morning.
Hi, Megan. I wanted to let you know that Darren's mother passed away this morning.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan. I'd like to recognize what Charlie said about all the volunteers that make this place what it is. I've been a little absent lately. It's not a reflection on my affection for the church. It's simply that I'm living kind of a busy life right now, but I look forward to talking to as many of you as I can over the next few weeks. Thanks.
Morning, my name is Nancy, and I just wanted to celebrate the fact that we have Rana Nuneker with us today. She's the daughter of Lorna Nuneker. She grew up in this church. She recently moved back to the area, and it's just wonderful to see her here today.
Hi, my name is Trish, and my dad's beautiful soul left this earth last Wednesday night.
Hi, my name is Tim, recovering from heart surgery a little while back, pretty recent actually, and I'm moved from being miserable to just being bad. And I'd like to thank so many members of the congregation for sending us notes, emails, and get well wishes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rhonda Nuneker. I grew up in this church, and I am working remotely, and I am staying with my mother, Lorna. And it's a true gift to be here in this moment, and I look forward to being present with this church and the congregation and all the love that I know that exists here. Thank you.
I know it's so good to see Rana here. A few days ago, I got a call and decided to send a contribution to MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. A friend of mine's daughter went to visit her daughter, my friend's granddaughter, in Atlanta, Georgia. Her granddaughter was a graduate student in Atlanta. And driving her mother back to the airport, they were hit by a drunk driver, and she was killed. Her granddaughter was killed, and the daughter was critically injured. So I was going to light a couple of candles for them today, but remember MAD, please.
So today, that gift that we call the present, we welcome Professor Matthew Countryman to the pulpit. Matthew will professionally qualify himself far more fittingly than I can ever introduce him or that you have read in news and notes. However, I can bridge connection of Matthew and the Unitarian Church of Hinsdale to one another. Professor Matthew's core relationship with this church is through the Quaker-founded farm and wilderness camps in central Vermont, sometimes or often called F&W for short, Farm and Wilderness F&W. F&W over the decades originating with connection, our connection originated with UCH's, that's our church, minister in the 1970s, most of the 1970s, of a lifelong UU, John Nichols, who, in addition to his commitment to our church, staffed the Farm and Wilderness as a counselor during the summers. And following his tenure here at this church, and along with 23 years as minister to the UU Society of Wellesley Hills, Massachusetts, John continued his summers at F&W, including in key roles in its administration. In that, he worked with Matthew's mother, who served on the board. But John, in serving Wellesley Hills, a significant thing is that, speaking to the chalice that we've heard about in this church, is that is the church that the service committee grew out of. And the service committee is what gave rise to the chalice that has been adopted now by the whole UU society. So he served there at Wellesley Hills. John did from 77 to 2000, before serving as an interim at a number of UU congregations well into the second decade of this 21st century. John's deeply informed, engaging, esteeming, and thoughtful ministry to this church during the 1970s clearly forecast his reach in very effectively and positively uniting individuals in the world at large, now very paralleled by Professor Countryman in his accomplishments and realms of academia. The Countryman and Nichols families are decades acquainted, and those are just some of the connections. Matthew Countryman. After a few more tunes.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Mother and Son by Jason Reynolds. It started early, maybe 6 in the morning. We'd each drunk half a cup of coffee,
but there was surely no time to finish because we had to go. My mother put on her hair and lipstick, gold earrings and perfume, but no heels, not even short ones. Not on this day. She knew we'd be standing. We left the house, the crisp air of November greeting us, and walked the half mile in the autumn orange toward Potomac High School. But halfway there, maybe not even halfway, we met the end of the line. "All y'all waiting to vote?" my mother asked a young woman, the anchor before us. The woman nodded. For weeks, the whole neighborhood had been buzzing. The gas stations and barber shops, the mail carriers and preachers, everyone gabbing about Barack Obama. And we all had shown up as if he'd be waiting for us at the school, as if he'd be the one handing out the confirmation stickers, as if we were voting for a family member, and this was an overdue reunion. Kids were everywhere, some running around playing, others sitting high on the shoulders of young fathers. Elders, like my mother, inching forward with canes and walkers, unwavering smiles smeared across their faces. Dr. Henderson, a neighborhood legend, was doing his signature three-fingered handshake. He'd lost 2 fingers in a lawnmower accident, a story he loved to tell kids. The knuckleheads were there, the nerds were there, the nosy neighbors and never talk to nobodies, all there, together. Music, dancing, jokes, snacks. There was order, inch by inch. Respect, person to person. And a palpable pride that seemed to tilt the chins of thousands of black people toward hope. It took hours. My mother and I got home in the middle of the day and sat at the kitchen table to confer. I pulled out a small recorder I'd purchased just for this occasion. "I can't believe I just did that," my mother said. "I voted for a black man who might actually win." She turned the TV on. "He'll win." I pushed record. "Baby, I've been alive a long time, and I know more about America than you ever will. They'll do anything to discredit us. Say we're not human until they can't anymore. Then they'll say we're not American. Say we're not smart, and if we are, then they'll say we're too arrogant. So if there's one thing never guaranteed to us here, it's victory." While we finished our coffee, I asked her questions about how this felt and after having been a child in South Carolina in the 50s. She mentioned her memories of Emmett Till's murder and coming of age in Washington, D.C., and she recounted being at the March on Washington. "But this," she said, flipping through the channels before landing on the news, "this is different." It was late, close to midnight. It had been a long day of standing, then sitting, and now my mother was lying in bed. And instead of spending this moment in a bar with friends, I lay next to her, my arms wrapped around her torso like a chrysalis while watching her transformation. And like an apparition, the first black president took the stage, along with his black wife and 2 black daughters. I could feel my mother's blood pressed my ear to her neck and could hear her heart. Breath caught in her throat when she broke open and wept the tears of the family members I'd never known and for the ones yet to come. But her heart seemed to do an opposite thing. It seemed too slow, to beat and rest, a peaceful thump in my ear, a metronome of new potential. And no matter how short-lived it would all be, I knew without a doubt it was a sound I'd need to remember.
Now, Professor Countryman.
Good morning. I have a lot to say. But let me start by asking if we might have a moment of silence for Tyree Nichols, who's over here, and for all of those who have suffered from our history of racial violence in this society. I want to try to do 2 things today. One, to tell you a little bit about my family story, and I'll say a little bit more about why I'm doing that, and then to say a little bit about Black Lives Matter and the current moment. As an historian, you won't be surprised that I'll be trying to talk about that in the context of the history of black protest and particularly the history of the civil rights movement. That's the academic side of me, and so I will try to rein that in a little bit when I get to that part. But I want to start with some thanks, first of all. As Charlie said, we first met, I can't count, 1975, I won't try to work out how many years ago, 2 12-year-old boys on our first night at sleepaway camp. And I could regale you with stories, but we don't have time for that, so maybe later. And I don't think I've seen Charlie, I don't think we've since we were 13. So it's just, first of all, I'm tremendously honored that he would think to invite me, and incredibly honored by how much work and thought he's put into this service. And so I just deeply appreciative to Charlie for everything. And this extraordinary music, Jamie, thank you. It's really been a wonderful, lots of people I wish could hear all of that. So and I will make sure they do as I can. So by spreading the word. So Charlie as Charlie says, we met at Quaker summer camp, and I am a birthright, as we say in the Friends world, a birthright friend, that I was born into a Quaker family. As a mixed race Quaker, that may conjure all kinds of images about you may expect you know a little bit about who I am, but I'm going to actually reverse all of that and tell you a little bit of how my family's journey to Quakerism and the way it I think reflects a kind of evolution of the Quaker teaching, or what we call the Quaker testimony on racial justice. I come from Philadelphia. And that's where my family came to Quakerism, but not in the 1750s or the 1850s, but the 1950s. It is the black side of my family that came to Quakerism, so that may surprise you. They came to Philadelphia is next to London, I guess, and I don't keep track of the numbers, but they're the two largest communities of Quakers in the world. So there is a history of black folks in Quakerism in Philadelphia. The best known figure you may know is Bayard Rustin, who, among other things, was one of Dr. King's chief aides. Many consider him the most important strategist of the Civil Rights Movement. He was the chief organizer of the March on Washington in 1963, and I could go on, many other things about Bayard. What you may not know is that, yes, he did grow up Quaker outside Philadelphia, but in a Quaker meeting that was a segregated meeting. The black family sat in one part of the church. And he would not have been, and he was not welcome at any of the Quaker schools in the Philadelphia area. In fact, part of the story that I will tell is about how my mother came to be the second African American to attend Germantown Friends School, which is one of the largest Quaker schools in the city, and the first to graduate. And how in that process my family came to join the Quaker meeting. But this is also the story, my family's story is also the story of the Northern Color Line. The white side of my family is actually from Chicago. My father grew up on the border between Morgan Park and Mount Greenwood on the southwest edge of Chicago. And I'll say a little bit more about how my parents came to know each other, which I think is in many ways a story both of the Northern Color Line, but also of the Civil Rights Movement. And these are the experiences that shaped my work as an historian. I should say that last night I was reading through some stuff and I was reminded that Rosa Parks, right, who we think of as this paragon of the Southern movement, lived the last 48 years of her life in Detroit. She moved there in 1957, not surprisingly in large part because neither she or her husband could work anymore in Alabama. But what she said of her life and what she said about race relations in Detroit and across the North, the Northern Promised Land that wasn't. And that is, I think, the story that is the story of my family, but it is also, in many ways, I think, the story that leads us to Black Lives Matter. So I will try to tell in my time left. And I can talk, so you just have to be patient with me. I will do my best to do that in the time, and we will have lots of time to talk further. So the story of how my family comes to Quakerism is really the story of my family's commitment to education. A generational story. On both sides, both my maternal and paternal, my maternal grandfather and grandmother both came from families of teachers, people who'd gone to school, who attended the historically black colleges, universities in the late 19th century. My grandfather had the good fortune to be able to go to Howard, right at the onset of the Depression, put himself through Howard University in Washington, D.C. as an elevator operator. My grandmother got a scholarship to attend Morgan College, now Morgan State University, another historically black college in Baltimore where she grew up, but was unable to take that because didn't have the car. She said she didn't have the car fare. That was the family story, which I think really means they needed her to work, right, for the family. She and her younger siblings in the time of the Depression. They met actually in the WPA in the New Deal in Harlem in the late 1930s, and eventually my grandfather had the good fortune to be hired as the first African American to teach at the high school level in the Philadelphia public schools, and they moved there, and my mother was born there in 1940. Very reminiscent of the story we just heard. She was 14 when the Brown decision was announced, 15 when Emmett Till was lynched. And that's a generational experience that I think is important that we recognize as those were the children who then were in college when the Civil Rights Movement, when the sit-ins come across the South. My family moved to a neighborhood called Mount Airy in Philadelphia in the mid-1940s, just as there were certain blocks, certain houses that were being advertised as now open to colored families, and in which the color line was not so much breaking down as shifting, moving spatially across town, and across lines, and that is an aspect of racial lines in the North that we have told ourselves is not really a story of law. It's not like Jim Crow laws, and it's a story kind of people made choices, and it was sort of how things operated. When in fact it was pretty consciously policy, right? That there was, and I won't go into, I can talk about this a lot later if you're interested, but the ways in which both public and private institutions, the real estate industry, local governments, work together to draw lines of where black folks could live, where white folks could be assured that there would be no black folks living, those kinds of choices. And my mother, this is when my mother was about 5 years old, that they moved into this neighborhood. The local elementary school was an integrated school. My mother would walk there every morning with her best friend. In second grade, she and her best friend considered themselves the best readers in the class. They read ahead in the reader. This was not something you did in 1947 in public schools in Philadelphia, and the teacher found out that they had read, and she punished them for reading ahead in the reader by having them clean the closets, dust the closet in the classroom. This is a story that we were told growing up in my family, but it's only later that in conversation we really hit us what this meant to my, time just goes, what this meant to my grandparents, their commitment to education, to have a white teacher put their black child in the closet to clean because she was too smart. And that's how they came to the Quaker school. They took her out, and they were fortunate enough that there had been change in the Quaker school, that a school that had never had black students, that had turned down a very prominent black family just 3 or 4 years earlier, decided that now was the time to recruit them. And both my grandmother and my aunt, both my mother and my aunt would both attend Germantown Friends. My mother would teach there for 20 years. My sister and I would attend, were lifers at that school, and it's through the school that we came to the camps where I got to meet Charlie. And in that process, they were participants, right, in a kind of rethinking of what Dr. King and others had called the most segregated day of the week, Sunday, right, of what the worship service was. And I think it's a journey that we still are on, right, to imagine what is a world in which our institutions, and I don't think integration is necessarily the sole solution, but our institutions are open and they're spaces of equity and equality for everyone. Quickly, the story of my parents' meeting, and I'll have just time for like one comment about Black Lives Matter, it looks like. So as I said, my father was from Morgan Park. His side of the family were, in fact, I have great-grandparents who were very much involved in the real estate industry in the 1920s during that suburban boom and drawing those kinds of lines. Morgan Park High School, where my father attended, was in fact integrated, but in his description, the black students were restricted to the vocational track in the basement. He was in the college track on the higher floors. And that clearly never sat well with him. Particularly, he had the good fortune to be part of a Christian youth group in his church, a young pastor who'd spent time in the South. And that's what led him into interest in the civil rights movement. But I think he's not unique. I mean, this is my parents' generational experience. They were the children of the Cold War, children who recognized the contradiction between a society that was so racially segregated and a nation that claimed to be a beacon of democracy, right? And that contradiction so unsettled so many of them, right, that they became active in the civil rights movement. My parents eloped in 1962 as activists in an organization they had built called the Northern Student Movement, which was an organization that was both supporting Southern students and also beginning to address racial inequality in the North. They eloped because my father's parents would never approve their marriage, and my father was not yet 21. And I can tell more about that story. The point of the story, though, to tell is that for the first 6 years of my life, my family was not welcome in Morgan Park at the family house. My grandparents would only meet my parents outside the neighborhood, not because they were disappointed, they weren't happy, but they were not. But they just were embarrassed, to be frank. They didn't want the neighbors to know, literally. And we only went when I was 6 because they'd sold the house already and were moving to Florida. But the end of the story is that when I graduated from high school in 1981, by that point my grandmother had passed, but my grandfather came to Philadelphia for the high school graduation and stayed in a little temporary, like it wasn't a hotel, it was an apartment building where my grandparents were living, but you could get a little apartment for like a couple days, and essentially was hosted by my maternal grandparents, and that transformation for me symbolizes the kind of hope we have to sustain in these challenging moments, the ability to come together, to forgive, and to be connected, right? And that's what my grandfather in his last years achieved. I should say that the other key to all of this was my father's siblings, my aunts and uncles, who embraced us always. So just a shout out to them. All right, I have much to say, and I'm not going to go on too long. But let me just say, let me first of all read a quick quote, and then talk about how we get to today. One of the great things about being the child of civil rights activists, see, there we go, stop, is that I got to meet all these interesting people, and one of them was a man named Vincent Harding. Vincent Harding is a path-breaking African-American historian, received his PhD from the University of Chicago. He was also another key aide to Dr. Martin Luther King, a speechwriter of his, very instrumental in the speeches that King wrote about the Vietnam War at the end of his life, his too short life. And Vincent Harding was a Mennonite, came out of another one of the traditional peace churches, and obviously not a church that's known for its integration, its mixed raceness either. And I think he brought that, right, very much to his work there. And his book, he wrote a book called The River, about African American history, and the metaphor is the metaphor of black protest for freedom. And he wrote, "We may sense that the river of black struggle is people, but it is also hope, the movement, the transformative power that humans create and that creates them, us, and makes them, us, new persons." I turn to Dr. Harding's work to understand the protest movement after the George Floyd murder, a movement that has, I think, rightly been called the largest and the most diverse protest movement in American history. And the challenge to understand it in part comes from the fact that Black Lives Matter, which is now more than a decade old, had largely kind of quieted, understandably, in the early years of the Trump regime, right? Protest, when you don't have the sense of possibility, is often very difficult. It's limited in people. And what Professor Harding's words that struck me was that the black freedom struggle is sometimes powerful, tumultuous, roiling with life, at other times meandering and turgid. In other words, there's an ebb and flow to our struggles for racial justice. The civil rights movement emerges at a time when, in fact, it shouldn't come. It shouldn't happen, right? Who are the people who make the civil rights movement? They are the poorest. They are the most politically weak. In a time of the Cold War in which anybody who imagines themselves a dissident, a critic of American society, is treated as un-American, as beyond the pale. How is it that these people almost completely locked out of the political system could turn it on its head, right? Could make that kind of a change? These are the questions that social movement historians like myself roll over at night about trying to understand. Social movements are unpredictable. They are constantly changing. They are very fragile. And yet they are essential to our sense of change and to what makes our society move in better directions. I can talk a lot, and I will, if you're interested, about why, under those conditions, in fact, we can try to understand why the civil rights movement actually doesn't emerge from that moment. I will take you back to that contradiction between the nation as a beacon of freedom and yet as dependent on a system of racial segregation that was both seemed permanent and was also so deeply violent and anti-democratic. But instead of doing that right now, because I've got lots to say about that, I'm going to skip over all of this. Let me just say about the current moment, right? That this is, again, the kind of complexity we are facing. Black Lives Matter emerges at a time when the civil rights movement, that tradition seemed to be not only over, but long gone, in which black politics was about elections and about people like President Obama, and a tremendous sense of, of gradual progress, but you have to work within a kind of system. And protests seem, either dated or ritualized, those kinds of things. And yet it brings to life, right, that sense, again, of the contradictions in our society. The fact that our political system, our political leadership has failed to address and grapple with the fact that the differences between who we want to be and who, in fact, our lives are for so many. That is the kind of crux that, in the right moment, makes social change happen. And I'll just close by saying, as someone who works with young people, has for almost 30 years in my career, every generation is my parents' generation, in a sense. Every generation, and all of us, are grappling with the contradictions between what we claim to be and what the world actually is. And it's not, I don't believe in great generations. I don't believe it's that my parents were different, or that the few of us who got involved in the anti-apartheid movement when I was in college were somehow different. There's something else that goes on. The opportunity to make that change is a much more complicated thing. But the key thing is that when those opportunities emerge, that those are the moments in which we have to act, in which we have to take action. I realize I just completely forgot. So that's my closing. But I just want to say, these pictures that Charlie so wonderfully did, those are my grandparents up there on the far right. And those are my parents right below them as civil rights activists in the 1960s. And then, sorry for this, I just have to walk over here. And this is my daughter, protesting in Black Lives Matter just a few years ago. So Charlie did this incredible thing for me, so I'm just deeply proud and thankful of that. So anyway, I'll stop there, but thank you.
just a few things I overlooked earlier is to just emphasize the virtue of the Academy of Intellectual Pursuit University that enables us to consider these things in a structured way and really make progress. The other is the word integration came up, and it reminded me of a key aspect of John Nichols, that he, when working with us young people, he took us, he shared his dismay when during 1968 he was a student at Meadville in Hyde Park, and the mushroom clouds of smoke that erupted in the city after King was assassinated. The other is John's mention of integration, the word integration. John led us young people to two communities, Hyde Park and Oak Park, emphasizing that they were integrated communities, and that was, from here it was a difference. So I've regarded both those communities as progressive ever since. And then he took us, led so many of us to the camps, which were intentionally diverse of culture and people and race. And finally, the album, the Martin Luther King album here on the display is from the church archive. It was published in 1968, same year as King died, and it lists for $60, but it is priceless. Now, we will conduct the offertory for the financial support of this church. So first, we will read together these words printed in the order of service. This church is made up of all of us. It is what we learn together, the work we do together, the fun we have together. It is what we share with one another, with people around us, and with the world.
Read a poem that my father actually wrote. I lost both my grandfather and my father in the same 2-year period when I was in graduate school. And I'm very fortunate that in that period, just before all that happened, my father wrote the following poem. And my father spent the latter years of his life in part as a poet, an unpublished poet, but a poet. The poem is called Ode to a Common Man, and it is dedicated to William Kennedy, my grandfather. I get worn out writing poems for the nearly dead. And Bill had too much fizz, too much intelligent sparkle to pass for an honest corpse. He also had a slightly brittle, nervous edge to his constant, curious energy, as if he sensed black men of his time and place courted danger when coming at life so undefended, as if he dreamt of mobs and fires and long bloody ropes choking the overbold, after years of patching up battered ghetto kids and his own still vibrant child. He welcomed me, an indignant white neophyte, fed me as buses were burned and churches bombed, respected me even when drugs of despair took me down and almost out, grandfathered my children so they knew more of keeping faith with whence they came. Oh, forgive us, please, for we comprehend little of what we do in this bound and strangled land. We stumble and grope and often fear those we wish to embrace more than any real enemy. Ache for those who leave us, because now they are safe to love.
We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. That which touches me most is that I had a chance to work with people passing on to others that which was passed on to me. To me, young people come first. They have the courage where we fail. And if I can shed some light as they carry us through the gale, the older I get, the better I know that the secret of my going on is when the reins are in the hands of the young, who dare to run against the storm, not needing to clutch for power, not needing the light just to shine on me. I need to be the one in the number as we stand against tyranny. Struggling myself don't mean a whole lot. I've come to realize that teaching others to stand up and fight is the only way my struggle survives. I am a woman who speaks in a voice, and I must be heard. At times, I can be quite difficult. I'll bow to no man's word. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Please stand.